Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by W. Curtis Preston, Chief Technical Evangelist at Druva, and we'll be talking about data backup and disaster recovery. Curtis, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. I'm excited to dig into data backups and recovery. I think it's one of those topics people kind of take for granted until they, of course, have some kind of emergency, or maybe they have developed some past scar tissue from a recovery situation or something like that. But
I like that. I've never heard that term, scar tissue, but I like that. Yeah, I like that.
I have some of my own war stories. But before we kind of dive into that, can we start by having you introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And how did you end up where you are today?
Well, let's see. W. Curtis Preston, right? You already gave my name and my title. I am the webmaster of backupcentral.com. I've written 4 books for O'Reilly that were all in and around backup. And actually this month, which is January, that's when we're recording this in 2023, I have been in the industry for 30 years, if you can believe that. Started out as the backup guy at what at that time was the second largest credit card company in the U.S., which was MBNA back then. Got acquired by Bank of America many years ago. And still to this day, when I think about the fact that I, a person who knew nothing about Unix and computers and backups and backup tape, I was handed the keys to the backup kingdom of a $35 billion company and said, here, do it, right? That's how I got my start. And then I spent actually a few years trying to get out of backup, right? Like a lot of people did. I wanted to go into sysadmin business, right? And through a series of things that were not planned, the first, say, 3 or 4 years, several years, I was trying to do other things, I went into consulting. I wanted to be a sysadmin. But backup, I just kept literally tripping over backup stuff in the wild. And I couldn't help myself. And then next thing I know, I started writing articles, and then I wrote my first book, and it was published in '99. We were at the time, you may have heard of the Y2K, thing, and so we were all very focused on that at the time. And then since then, I've done a variety of things, and for 5 years now, I've been this chief technical evangelist at Druva, which is a fun job where I get to take my technical expertise and help explain that world to others.
Yeah, so it sounds like it wasn't a by design career choice. It was something that that was the job that you get at the time, and then through this gravitational pull to backups, you just kept finding yourself back there, and now you've essentially spent majority of your career in it and developed deep expertise essentially in the world of backups and disaster recovery.
Yeah, I initially certainly did. I planned to do anything else, right? Just like a lot of people, right? Yep. But I at some point I realized I had accidentally developed an expertise in an area that most people run away from. And then once I got the publishing bug, I had written that first article in Sysadmin magazine, which is no longer around, but I wrote that first article, and getting emails from around the world of having people, thank me for, opening their eyes and explaining things. That changed things for me, right? And then that's when I got the idea to write the book. And then once you've written a book on something, well, then, that's pretty much going to be what you do, right?
Yeah. That's why I keep holding off on doing that. But I think, there's lots of stuff even in my own career, I think I never planned to do. I think people, if you've been around long enough in the tech industry, I think a lot of times you end up potentially doing something out of necessity, and then that ends up being like a defining characteristic of your career. For me, that was marketing. Right. My training is an engineer, and that's really where I started my career. But I was also a startup founder, and then I had to basically learn business and marketing, and that's kind of how I fell into that. But anyway, back to backups. Kind of starting to dig into this topic a little bit deeper. What are like the common sort of mistakes that organizations make when it comes to data backup and recovery? Obviously, you've seen a big spectrum of technical changes that have happened throughout your career when it comes to like dealing with this issue. And I'm sure maybe the problems that existed 20 years ago are different than the ones that are today, but maybe we can, start with essentially today.
Yeah, absolutely. The problems from even 10 years ago really are non-existent in the typical backup environment. Back then, what we were fighting tape, right? And there was a fundamental misunderstanding of how tape worked, and that was what everybody did wrong. If you asked me 10, 20 years ago, it would have been that answer. Today, I would say that like if I had to pick one thing right now, it's not putting enough cybersecurity focus on backup. And that's true across the board, regardless of which way you're doing backup. There's sort of, I'm going to say like 3 broad categories. There's, I'm going to buy a box and put Windows on it, and I'm going to buy some backup software from pick your favorite backup software product, and I'm going to install that and configure it, basically build your own system. And then the second category would be appliances, right? Purpose-built backup appliances, PBBAs, we call them. And you can buy a box that does it for you. And then the third would be a service like the company that I work for, Druva, a SaaS service, right? Which is, I think it's the way people are doing it or in the future. But across all 3 of those, when you look back, one thing that's been consistent and hasn't changed since I started backup, and I'm guessing it was that way before, is that nobody wants to do the backups. That's how I got my job, and and I tried to get out of it myself. But because of that, you have a lot of very junior people running the backup system, and they often are also not very savvy when it comes to ways of cybersecurity. And when you couple that with the absolute fact that the ransomware groups of today are directly targeting backup systems to either A, take them out of the equation from, they want to do a traditional ransomware attack and the backup system is standing in their way, or the new thing, which is data exfiltration via the backup system. So if they're able to somehow gain control of the backup system or crack its encryption algorithm, they can use the backup system as a giant source of a ton of really incredibly important data. And so I think that companies should be focusing on that. Like if they did nothing else, they should do that. So that would be my number one.
So given this like history essentially where, backups is kind of given to the junior person, but now we've moved from, what was maybe like an on-prem world, on-prem backups, where maybe the consequences of an issue with the backups is less impactful to an organization than something like on cloud, where there's like a cybersecurity attack and someone goes and deletes all the backups and does a ransomware attack, or maybe breaks down the encryption and gets access to all this sensitive data. Do you think that this like ownership as a junior person is just like a legacy issue? Like, in the old days, people just kind of forgot about it. We'll give it to, the new person on the team. And then they've continued essentially that behavior, but now the problem's much more complicated and difficult to manage.
So I'm gonna have to sort of correct a few misconceptions that it sounds like you have about the way backups are still done. First off, most data center backups are still being done in the data center, meaning if you have a data center, most backups are still being done by a box, an appliance, or a box that you've installed software on, right? And so that's sort of number one. And number two, there was something you said about that. It sounded like you thought that the cloud sort of has increased the risk. I would say it's the opposite. that it's that box in the data center who nobody is paying any attention to, and it's not updating its patches as they should be, and is not applying basic security concepts like MFA, least privilege, password management, et cetera, that when you look at the cloud, so there's two ways to look at the cloud. One is the wild, wild west, right? So I go and I use AWS, Azure, et cetera. Who knows what people are doing there, right? The cloud it's just tools, right? The other are providers that are actually designed to do something like backup for you. Druva is one of those. In those, they're basically making sure that all those best practices are being followed. But when it's just a box in a data center, that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to understand was that you said in the current state that cybersecurity essentially is the thing that organizations need to pay attention to. So why is it then that is a bigger issue now with the way we're doing backups in the cloud world, if things have gotten better because of these things that you're mentioning, where patches are applied, it's no longer just a box in the corner of the room that people have forgotten about?
Because most people haven't moved to the cloud for backups, right? If they have moved to the cloud for their cloud, so if they've moved into AWS, Azure, GCP, they're doing cloud backups of that generally. There are some of those who are even, earlier I said there's a lot more on-prem backup appliances than it sounds like you might think. Not only are there still a ton of those, and it's still the predominant way, there are even people that are using cloud providers and continuing to use an on-prem backup appliance to back up the cloud. Right? They're literally pulling that cloud data down into that on-prem appliance. I don't understand that at all. Even after I apply my obvious bias that I work for a cloud backup company, like I don't like you're in the cloud, you're getting the advantages of the cloud. Why would you want to bring that back in time into the data center? I don't understand. But most people that are running in the cloud, they are using some type of cloud backup system, but most people that are running in the data center are still using a data center based backup system. They may copy some of that data to the cloud, but it's being done and managed and run by that. And that this thing of the junior person, that is still absolutely the case, right? It's just nobody wants to raise their hand and say, I'll take charge of the backup system, because they know it's historically problematic. It's a job, it's kind of a thankless job, right? You're invisible or you're in trouble. And
if you're doing your job no, there's no issues. But if you're not doing your job well, then it's like escalated to the C level essentially. Exactly. So the thing is that the reason why I see it, this problem has always been the case, the cybersecurity aspect, but the threat actors weren't directly going after the backup system until the last couple of years. It literally started in the last year or two, and it was a direct result of, when we look about like 2014, when the ransomware first started, and then as it continued to develop, people that actually had a decent backup and DR system were able to tell the ransomware groups to go pound sand. And so then they said, okay, well, we're going to start targeting the backup system, see if we could basically shoot them in the head so that they can't be used as a defense against our normal ransomware attack. And then the next escalation is they said, this is like literally the crown jewels. You've got all of the company's data backed up to one place, and we're going to directly target that. This includes modern systems like Druva. So we've had customers have their backups attacked via our backup system. Now, the only way that could, today is to gain administrative control.
So you use, and we've had customers who have had that, where the threat actors gained administrative control over their Druva backup system. And even they had gained, I can think of one where they had MFA, but the hackers had gained control of the email system that they used for MFA. By the way, don't use email as your MFA. But anyway, so they had done that. And so what they were doing was they were going in Druva and deleting backups, right? So we have a feature to essentially block that or undo it depending on what the customer wants to do, right? We can enable that so that the customer, if they can specify at backup creation, when a backup is created and it's supposed to, let's say, have 90-day expiration, they can make a setting that says that's not ever allowed to be changed. So once a backup is made, it's in there for 90 days, right? All of the backup vendors have had to adapt to this world. And I don't think many of the customers have made that same adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also the sage advice about not using email as your 2FA.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier also this, with the attacks, essentially, if someone gets the backup and they're able to crack the encryption on it, then suddenly they have access to all this data. So what are like some of the best practices that organizations need to follow, especially when it comes to like backing up personal user data, things like account data, other sensitive data, that stuff's regulated. You can find if you're holding on to that data forever,
right.
Big deletion challenge, how do you go and actually, delete a user record from all the backups as well as the, the active databases and so on?
Yeah. So there's a bunch in there, right? So the first thing that I think that people should do with their backup system, regardless of which type of backup system we're talking about, is that the usernames and passwords should not be in something like Active Directory, okay? Don't put your usernames and passwords for something that it's your last line of defense. It should not be just another username and password in Active Directory. I think it should be, and by the way, I have this opinion about all administrative passwords. I don't think they should be in Active Directory. And I'm familiar with LAPS. Call me old school. Well, I'm old school, but new school, right? I believe in a password manager, right? A separate password manager that isn't Active Directory. So keep you should think of the backup system as like the first line of defense in a cyber attack, and make sure that username and password is separate. Make sure it has MFA. Make sure that the backups, and by the way, this will sound like I'm bashing competitors. It's not, but a Windows-based backup system, if it's on Windows, some of the backup products store the administrative, like the username password database, inside a database that uses the machine. I believe it's called the machine code. Or the machine key. I'm not a strong Windows guy, but it's the machine key that is universal to Windows. And it's not that hard to hack and get that machine key. And then that means it's easy to get the administrative password. So I'm not a huge fan of Windows-based, backup systems for that reason. But if it is a Windows-based system, find out if there's a way to make sure that isn't the case, that your username and passwords are not easily hacked. I already talked about MFA. The other thing is that the backups, the actual backup data, should be stored in such a way that it's not visible as a file on the backup server. Now that is not immediately obvious to most people. So most people, a Windows box or a Linux box, they put in their backup software. They're going to use disk for their backup system. They have a file system called /backups, right? Or /backups. And that's where their backups go in their files. Well, when their files are easily findable, they're easily deletable, they're easily corruptible. So don't do that. There are other ways. There are purpose. But if you're going to do on-prem stuff, then have backups stored in a way that they're not visible as files. It just makes them so much easier to hack. I'd say that's sort of the, then I would just, on the end, I would say, if that kind of stuff concerns you, consider a service, right? Consider the fact that no one wants to do this, right? You hire a plumber. That's another job that nobody wants to do, right? And so you get a plumber because he's making buku bucks doing the job that nobody wants to do, right? Well, do this for backups, right? Let your IT people do the stuff they think is sexier, whatever that is, but give this super special, super important job to a service that can handle all these things for you and make sure they're already being done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. Like, why make your last line of defense like something that you're taking on yourself if you don't have the built-in expertise and the years of experience to do that. And also, it's not just a matter of backups, there's also the recovery scenario. When I had my own company, we used, cloud-based backups. We did, followed best practices, such as they were at the time, but it was all a home-based solution. And I think in the worst case scenario, we could technically recover things, but it wasn't exactly a one-click redeploy scenario.
Right.
So, are companies that are, more sophisticated than, say, my, prior company from a, recovery standpoint, what are they doing to manage recoveries? And is that something that like companies are typically like doing ongoing testing to understand like what is our ability to recover in the case of a disaster?
Well, the good ones do. The smart ones do, right? We say it all the time that, a backup isn't really a backup until you've tested its recovery. And what I think makes that easy is if you have something that can help automate that, right? I remember, it's like 15 years now, but when Veeam first came out with, I think they called it Sure Backup. This was this idea that you could define a recovery group, you could mount that recovery group, you could basically do some testing against it, and you could automate that, right? I remember thinking, in fact, I remember blogging about it, that like, this is the greatest feature in the history of backup, automated testing. How amazing is that? You move forward to today, it's become more common. And so the key is, with Druva, for example, it's easy to test a single file or a database restore. That's pretty easy. You can even automate it through the use of APIs and things like that. What's more complicated for many environments is to do a full disaster recovery. So what we're able to do is you can define a recovery group. You can define, things like how big of a VM you want to use for each of the VMs. There's a default, of course, that are given for you. And then but you can customize it. You can specify things like boot order and scripts that are run before and after, all that kind of stuff. You define that once. And then you should be able to test it very easily. I know in Druva, basically, you can test a disaster recovery with literally the press of a button, right? And it can do all of the stuff that it needs to do, essentially without failover. That's what a test is, right? And then there is a full DR. Basically the full DR is to fail over. You should be able to test that, right? And you should be able to test it. It should be easy. Again, going back to 100 years ago when I was at the bank, a DR test meant we recovered a handful of systems in the data center. We had hundreds of servers. We would recover like 3 or 4 of them, and it was all hands on deck for an entire weekend. And all we could say was that we recovered these 3 or 4 servers, and then we just rotate the servers, and we did it every 6 months. And it was a huge pain in the butt weekend process. It took forever, and it was terrifying every time. Every time you did it, it was terrifying, right? nowadays, with modern technology, you should be able to literally just click something or run an API, and that it should automate that recovery, and you should be able to test that as often as you would like to.
Mm-hmm. So, you started to touch on a little bit the company that you work for, Druva, and the Druva platform, and how it helps organizations with essentially offloading the responsibility of backups and recovery. But what is it that's sets Druva apart, perhaps, from other data protection and backup solutions that are on the market?
So if you had asked me, so I joined 5 years ago. If you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said. So you're familiar with Gretzky's comment about skating where the puck is going?
Yes,
I'm
Canadian,
that, right?
So all Canadians are born with that knowledge.
Okay. So for like 5 years, we were skating where the puck is going. We were all by ourselves over in the corner of the rink. And that was this idea of being a SaaS-based data protection vendor. Okay. And I had to explain to people, right, what I don't understand, like, where are my backups? What is a SaaS backup provider? And I had to explain, that, it's like, well, you know what 365 is, what Salesforce is. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well, it's like that, but backups, right? Where all the infrastructure just magically just happens, right? You don't have to manage any of it. You don't have to secure it. That's becoming less or becoming more common. And so what we're having to do is explain the differentiation. And the biggest difference, because all of our competitors that are in the more traditional, the other two categories, they're all trying to get into the SaaS space. They are in the SaaS space. Just the question is how much, how much business they're doing. What all of them, save one, we have one competitor that actually has built a SaaS platform like we have. All of the rest of them, what they did was they took their on-prem solution and they lifted and shifted it into the cloud, right? They didn't refactor, they didn't redesign. They just literally, they're running a VM in the cloud, which has significant performance, growth, capacity, security limitations, even though it's being run as a SaaS offering. So the big thing, I think, with ours, one is from a cybersecurity perspective, the data stored in a completely different area than the metadata. The data is, if you're familiar with the concept of deduplication, right? All of the data is sliced up into really tiny chunks. Each one of those chunks becomes an object in S3. We happen to use AWS as our infrastructure provider, and so even if a customer, a hacker, a threat actor was able to access your S3 data, which of course it's set up, automatically so that that's not possible. But even if they did, what they would get is all these tiny little slivers of encrypted stuff without any knowledge of how to put it all back together and decrypt it, right? What our competitors tend to do is they still tend to think of S3 as a place to put a big blob, right? Like I do a full backup, and that's one object, and I put it in S3. That has significant performance ramifications, right? And so what a lot of them do is they then use block storage for the recent restores that actually need to be fast. Well, that has significant cost ramifications, right? It's because they were all designed as boxes, right? They were all designed as boxes with block disk. And so that still tends to be the way they're behaving in the cloud. And so what we would say is we're the ones that have been doing it for the way that it should be done for over 10 years. We're the largest. We are the only SaaS only company, right? That does this. There are a lot of people that are experimenting with it as their new business line. So give us a shot, basically.
Pardon the interruption, but it's me, Sean, the host. talking to you directly. I hope you're enjoying the episode, and if so, please subscribe and leave a positive rating and review. You can also join the Partially Redacted community at skyflow.com/community to make show suggestions, interact with me, other listeners, and privacy experts and enthusiasts. All right, now back to the show.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I want to kind of circle back to in there. It sounds like that, at the beginning there, you had essentially the category creation problem of, you were the first and sounds like still only true like SaaS backup and recovery system that exists. So then you had to essentially educate the market on why that makes sense versus whatever they're doing today. So, I guess it's a little bit like, what happened with, I think, like authentication as well. A little bit different, but where essentially everyone was rolling their own authentication and Auth0 and these other services came along and they're like, okay, well, you shouldn't do that. And now in a lot of ways, it's like you'd be crazy to write your own auth from scratch. It just doesn't make sense. But going back to the deployment model, so you talked about these S3 buckets and you're essentially putting small fragments of the backups and essentially you need to put those pieces back together. Now, where do those S3 buckets live? Is that deployed within like a customer's own AWS account?
No.
Or is that something that you're hosting and managing on their behalf?
Yes. So a Druva customer, the only bill they get is from us, right? So we, depending on what we back up, we charge them different based on different ways. So like if we're backing up Microsoft 365, we're billing them per seat, because that's the way 365, that's the way you pay for 365. So that's why you're going to pay for backups, right? So for an extra few dollars per seat, we'll back up your 365 environment. Same thing with Salesforce, same thing with laptops. If it's a data center, we globally deduplicate all the data and we store that in our S3 account and then bill you for the deduplicated result, right? So no, it's not going into your account. For both security and cost reasons, it goes into our account. And then from a recovery perspective, it goes directly back to wherever you need it to go.
And then can you talk a little bit about, maybe you have some examples of how organizations have successfully used like Druva to recover from, where they face disasters? I don't know if you have, stories that you can share there or not.
Yeah, we do. At this point, we are doing 2 to 3 ransomware recoveries a month, right? For reasons that are probably relatively obvious, I can't just throw out names of companies, but we have a handful that sometimes will go on record. But we have a number of very large companies, some of which are household names. I should have looked up a few for you, but darn it, one of the pharmaceutical companies that was big in fighting COVID is our customers, and it's killing me that their name is not popping up to me right now. But like I said, we're doing a couple of ransomware recoveries a month, where basically what we typically do is we're spinning this up in the cloud automatically, then helping them make sure that recovered result is ransomware free. We have something called advanced ransomware recovery, which is specifically for file system-based systems. The problem with the file system-based ransomware recovery is that the ransomware may be in your environment for a while before it gets noticed, and it may be encrypting data over time without being noticed. And so then the question is, if the average dwell time, I think the mean dwell time of a ransomware attack is like 60 days. The time between the initial infection and being discovered is actually 60 days. So during that 60 days, they're often encrypting data. So how do you recover a file system like that if it's been being encrypted over 60 days? With traditional models, it's a mess. With ours, it's literally a couple of button presses. You just specify what's the start and what's the beginning, right? We can help you figure out when it started. and we say, so between January 1st and January 15th, give me the last best, the last unencrypted copy of every file, right? And we just do that automatically. But there have been, I told a story about the one earlier where it wasn't a recovery, but it was a defense against a ransomware attack, which was they had somebody that gained administrative control due to stolen credentials. Then they were able to go around the MFA, and they were then basically deleting backups. But because of a feature that we had already enabled, we were able to go in and basically essentially undelete those backups, right? I don't have a. I should have brought one, but I don't. I'm more on a different side of the business. But I should have a good story for you, and I don't. I apologize.
No worries. I imagine it's a little bit of a sensitive thing too for customers of Druva, where if it's successful, that's great, but they don't necessarily want to brag about that they were under attack by like some sort of ransomware hackers or something like that.
Yeah, it's really hard. I have my own podcast, and I've had one company that came on, not a Druva customer. They had one customer or one company that came on that talked about their ransomware attack and their experience. And the thing is, what you can hear from that episode, as well as what we're hearing from our customers that we're, again, doing a couple of times a month now, is that the actual recovery is the easy part. The actual restoring the data, right, that's easy. What's not easy is, figuring out what you need to restore, figuring out what you need to wipe, right? Basically figuring out, because that's the difference between a cyber recovery and a disaster recovery. A disaster, it's like, okay, drain the floors, right? Wipe the walls, right? Cut out the bottom 8 inches of drywall. And it's really easy. It's like, all the servers that are, 3 feet or lower, those are the dead ones. So you pull them out, you put them in, and you replace them. That's easy in comparison to a typical ransomware recovery. Because the challenge is that the disaster, the attack is still ongoing as you're trying to recover. So you're actively trying to stop it. So you have to, you have to stop the communication with the command and control servers. You have to stop communication, lateral communication between infected servers and non-infected servers. It's easy to do that. It's easy to, the easiest way is to just literally shut everything down, like literally power off all the servers. But not everybody's prepared to do that, right? From a business perspective. But believe it or not, that's actually, people are like, well, we don't know how bad it is, right? We don't know how bad I know it'd be easy, easy for me and you, sitting here Monday morning quarterbacking. Well, shutting down the servers is the easy way. Why don't you just do that? Well, they're thinking and hoping that the infection is only 1 or 2 servers. And so shutting down 500 servers, doesn't make sense to them to figure out how bad things are. So that's the complicated part, right? And also the logistics of figuring out who can do what. So what do I mean by that, right? So it's 3 a.m. on a weekend, and you're one poor slob who got stuck in the knock, right? It's 3 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday night on Christmas weekend. Because, by the way, that's when they attack, right? If you don't know, there's definitely a trend that they go after holidays and 3-day weekends and things like that. What is that person? What's his or her game plan? What's their rules of engagement? What are they allowed to do immediately to stop the bleeding? And who are they allowed to call at 3 o'clock in the morning when this is going on, right? That stuff so many times is not thought of in advance. So those are the things that we've learned from the number of recoveries that we've done.
So that complexity around sort of understanding the size of the attack, what's the best way to sort of like handle it and recover from it. Is that something that Druva like helps with, or are there other like tools and best practices people need to follow?
Yes, we do help with that. There are, and yet basically the answer is yes to both cases, right? So we are more than happy to help you develop that cyber recovery plan. We are more than happy to help you as a customer that didn't have a cybersecurity plan. That's the more common thing is, oh no, we got a ransomware attack and we didn't plan for this. What are we going to do? And then we can advise you to go through it. I would say one of the best practices is, and by the way, when I say it, you'll think I mean something else. So I'll explain. So contract with some cybersecurity insurance with a provider, right? This isn't about having somebody else pay the ransom. This is about having a contract that says, in the event that I get hit with ransomware, you have contracts with people that can help me out. That was in the story from my podcast. So it's SpectraLogic, by the way. It's a large tape backup company. They're the ones that got hit by the ransomware. And they felt that this was invaluable. They contracted the cybersecurity insurance the month before the attack. And then they said the best thing they got out of their money was having, as part of that contract, a cybersecurity expert who's an expert in responding to ransomware attacks on their side, working with them 24/7 to work through the stuff. I would say that would be the biggest one, is to get an actual cybersecurity specialist. And I'd say probably the best way to do that is to have insurance.
Mm-hmm. I see. What did you think? You've been in the space for a long time. You've seen a lot of transformation from a technology perspective, probably best practices perspective as well. What do you think the future of the space looks like?
So I think, like a lot of people, I think that more and more companies are migrating to the cloud. Right, not just backups, but they're migrating a lot. Not everybody's migrating, and some people are repatriating. Right, they have this fantasy that the cloud will be cheaper. It could be cheaper if you do it right. The way Druva has architected their product is architected with three things in mind: security, performance, and cost. And every time we look at adding a feature or changing a part of the architecture, we have to say, how will this affect our cost? And how will this affect our security? How will this affect performance? But you have to take cost into account, right? So you can, do really well in the cloud. But if, for example, one of the things that a lot of people don't think about when they're used to VMware, you pay for the license, you pay for the box, and you have a bunch of VMs that think they're all 5 terabyte VMs. They're not, right? They're pre-provisioned, right? And using thin provisioning technologies. Then you move each one of those VMs and they become an AWS VM. In the AWS world, you pay for what you provisioned, right? And so it's just, my point is that a lot of people are moving into the cloud. Some of them save money, some of them don't. What I do see is, fewer and fewer of these, what still dominates the market, which is the on-prem backup systems, right? To me, at this point, that is a great design for 20 years ago, right? Unfortunately, a lot of those companies, they So I think that more companies like Druva will come into play, right? I don't see these on-prem companies. I don't see them successfully migrating to a SaaS provider. I don't know any company anywhere that's done that, other than they shut off the old and they do the new, right? Because you can't be both. Because it just doesn't, from a business perspective, it doesn't work when you have two completely competing business lines, right? You're going to cannibalize from each other. You're going to have, if you do it right, you're going to have two completely different code trees. So what I see, I don't see those being long-term successful. What I do see happening is we'll get more competitors. I think more and more vendors will be SaaS-based. The more cloudy you are, the more doing backups in the cloud makes sense. So I see more and more cloud backup vendors, over the time. The challenge that we have right now as we move into the future is that there are a ton of SaaS providers, right? Not backup, just SaaS, right? Just think about the number of SaaS products, you and I interact with on a daily basis. I mean, we're using one right now to do the recording of this, right? Not that long ago, we'd have to be sitting in the same room with some recording devices, right? There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies like this, and many of them produce data that should be backed up. And so what you're starting to see is a proliferation of companies that just do one thing, right? We just do Salesforce backup. We just do 365 backup. We just do GitHub backup. There are like hundreds of these companies that just do one or two or three products. That proliferation is going to continue for a while. But, it concerns me because now you're adding a lot more complexity to your backup system, because if you're using both Salesforce and GitHub and something else that you can only back, and you're using three different backup products to back up three different SaaS providers, that's just fraught with problems, right? So
it's like classic fragmentation problem. And
the world of SaaS, which is amazing, right? I love the world of SaaS. It creates this problem. So our job as IT practitioners, as we look at these new vendors, these new SaaS vendors, we need to look at each of them and see if they create data that they're storing that we don't want to lose. And then the question is, how is this data being backed up, right? Because 99.9% of the time, the answer is it isn't. That's the other, like if you go back to the very beginning of the podcast when you said what's the number one mistake people make besides the cybersecurity thing, is it's people that use SaaS providers and think that those SaaS providers are backing up their data. They're not, right? Unless it's in your contract. And so things like Microsoft 365, Salesforce, G Suite, all of these things, you get a major ransomware attack, you do something stupid, like there was a company right up your way. There was a company in the East Bay that had their entire code tree, their entire IP in Google Workspace. And then a well-meaning sysadmin deleted their account. He thought he was deleting the development account, but he deleted the main account, and boom, their company was gone.
That's a bad day for that guy.
That is a bad day. Yeah. And they were a true cloud company where they didn't have a cache. Like everything was up in Google Drive. That's the other big mistake, is that people use these SaaS providers and think that they're backing up the data, right? And you have things like, it's not a SaaS provider. Well, I guess so. Rackspace. You're familiar with the Rackspace outage?
It sounds familiar, but maybe
so December 2nd of last year, Rackspace had a hosted Exchange service, right? It's SaaS-ish because you're still administering Exchange, but they had a ransomware attack. It took down their environment, and it's never coming back up. So they moved their customers over to 365, and they actually did actually have backups as part of their contract, but it doesn't look like, based on what we're seeing in the behavior and what's happened since then, they didn't design the recovery and specifically the recovery that they would have to do that they're doing now, which is they had to restore, disinfect all of the Exchange servers, then create PST files for every single user. And it's going to be months, right, to get all that data back, right? What does that have to do with my point? My point is, far too many companies make the assumption that the SaaS vendor has a backup system or has one that's been tested. So don't make that assumption, right? Another prediction I will make is that a lot of companies will lose a lot of data because they make these assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think those sound like very sound predictions. Go back to this duality of offering essentially the on-prem box solution with trying to offer a cloud solution. I think there's clear philosophical divide between those worlds, and you got to choose a path.
Right.
It doesn't make sense to in a long-term sort of business go-to-market and product strategy to do both. So I think that's a good place to leave it. But is there anything else you want to share or point the listeners to?
Well, so my most recent book, so I've written 4 books, with O'Reilly, and the latest is Modern Data Protection. It was in 2021. You can actually get a free ebook copy of that by going to druva.com/ebook. And that, it's about 300 pages, a nice evening read. And it gives you advice across pretty much the entire spectrum of data protection, your various choices and whatnot.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely include that in the show notes for the episode. And I want to thank you so much for coming on. I thought this was really interesting and educational for me. I think backups, recoveries, as I mentioned at the top of the show, it's just like one of those things that everybody needs, but something that's overlooked or taken for granted. However, like a lot of topics, there's just a lot to it when you start to dig in, and if you want to do it right. So thanks for sharing all your experience with this.
Happy to do so.